Hello everyone, this is John from RPGs and More, and today I'd like to talk to you about a campaign setting that when I first encountered it, I didn't like it very much. I thought it was overly strange, too brutal. It just did not appeal to me. At the time, I was much younger than I am now, and I was very much into gothic horror. And so the first campaign setting that I ever got into was Ravenloft, as far as role-playing games go. And for a while, I actually thought that Ravenloft and Vampire the Masquerade were kind of the same thing. So that shows you how new I was to role-playing games at the time. I quickly learned differently. But anyway, so I also encountered this setting briefly, but it didn't grab me. Not until many years later, and it was kind of a slow process. So the setting that we're going to talk about is Dark Sun. This is a print-on-demand book of the original Dark Sun box set released by TSR. I picked this up from Drive-Thru RPG as a print-on-demand item, and I also have the PDFs. They're pretty cool. I bought this a while ago, probably about a year ago about now, and kind of started reading through it. But that's not when my interest in Dark Sun started. My interest in Dark Sun I can relay back to when I was in high school, playing and just getting started into the world of computer games, and I encountered Dark Sun Shattered Lands. And even at the time, it was a retro game. It was not the latest and greatest and the new hotness. But I was a fan of RPGs, and especially computer game RPGs, and I really dove into it. And the more I played it, I never actually beat the game. That's a weird thing about me. I play a lot of games, but I almost never end up beating them. I just enjoy the experience of the play more than I enjoy the hard pounding, gotta beat it kind of feeling of it. It's just an experience for me. So I played it, and the more I played it, the more I just came to really enjoy this bleak setting. It was very bleak and dark, but at the same time so very rich and full of color and different kinds of life and different ideas of what fantasy could be. There was nothing standard or expected about it. And so that kind of got me interested in Dark Sun as a setting. And I kept on occasionally checking in and seeing what was going on. And I'd read a few things here and there, but I never really dove deeply into it because I was like, oh yeah, that's fun. I enjoyed that game, but I don't know if I'd really like the setting, so I'd kind of toss it away and not worry about it. But I came back to it a couple of years ago and started really thinking about it, and I started thinking about why I found it so interesting. And so let me preface this by saying I have not actually played a game in the Dark Sun setting using the Dark Sun rules, nor have I run a game in that setting using any version of D&D rules. This is purely from the perspective of someone who has looked on and enjoyed the concept of the setting. But so this video is kind of aimed at those people who maybe were like me and didn't really give it the time of day for a long time. And I want you to maybe take this as a moment to learn a bit more about the setting, a bit more about the core of it. Not all the other little things that are out there. There's a lot of information out there for this setting. I have not read almost any of it. The only thing that specific to this setting that I've been reading is this book. But what is it about Dark Sun that attracts the mind? What is it about Dark Sun that makes it interesting? It is a dark setting. It is not a happy place. There are great and terrible things happening every day. But that is not to say that it is only grim and darkness and everyone's going to die. This is not necessarily like, those of you familiar with Warhammer 40k, this is not the grim darkness of the far past. This is Dark Sun, and Dark Sun is a unique take as far as D&D or campaign settings go for me, mostly because it takes all the familiar tropes of fantasy that I had been very familiar with at that time and turns a lot of them on their head. Even more so than did Ravenloft, because Ravenloft kind of worked to try to make the gothic horror tropes fit in a fantasy world. Whereas Dark Sun kind of takes all the tropes and says, nah, and makes its own thing. And that's something that's challenging to me as a reader and as a potential game master for this setting. It's challenging because I have to reevaluate what I expect from the setting. I have to reevaluate how will I present this, because there's no European-centric village whose architecture I can describe without even, looking it up, because I know that material because I've been immersed in that my entire life of the wattle and daub houses and stone castles and things. Like, these things just aren't there. Or if they are, then they're ancient ruins. Excuse me. That's what I get for filming a video after a long day. But let's move on. So there are, in my opinion, several pillars that underpin Dark Sun as a setting. First, resource scarceness. In the Dark Sun setting, metal is very rare. It's not non-existent. It's still possible for your character to get a steel or an iron dagger. But that in itself is a special treasure. That is something to be protected, something to be valued. And this is driven home by the fact that when you make a character, and you buy equipment for your character, you're rolling 5d4s like you might do for other games, multiplying it by 10 in some cases, and that's the number of copper pieces that you have to buy things with. And it changes and modifies a lot of the item lists in order to reflect that wood is scarce, and that a lot of things are made out of bone and stone. And I think that's fascinating. I think that is a great difference in the setting. It's not saying you can't get a bone sword, because you can. They're absolutely out there. In fact, it's a lot easier to get a bone sword than it would be to get a bronze sword. So Dark Sun is a setting that embraces more of a Stone Age or early Bronze Age technology that is accompanied by strong magic. Their magic is very prevalent in the Dark Sun setting. Now, it takes several different forms, but the thing is that outside of magic, there are not a lot of resources available. The things that people take for granted. You're not getting chainmail armor unless you are extremely wealthy, and even then, wearing a suit of chainmail armor makes you a target for every power-hungry, greedy cretin in the city that you're living in, including the lieutenants of the Sorcerer King that you're currently residing under, whose protection you're currently residing under. No, metal armor is almost unheard of in this setting. The idea of metal is highly prized, is valuable. Leather and stone and bone are the materials of the day. And even those are not always easy to get your hands on. So that's the kind of scarcity that I'm talking about. But that's not to say that there aren't lots of things going on in this world. Because next to that scarcity of things made out of metal and wood, there is a rich background of trade, mercantilism. You've got these big, massive merchant houses who specialize in moving from city-state to city-state, selling their goods, taking obsidian spearheads from one place, selling them in another location, and getting instead bits of wood that they can trade back to a third location, and kind of just creating these geometric shapes of any size and any variety you like of trade routes. And I think that that is an important thing to not miss in this setting. It's not that you can't get things, it's that you can't get steel. So you can get spices, you can get gems probably would be almost more readily available than gold. Just kind of think about that. And there's armor made out of chitin from insectoid creatures. So, this is bad. Anyway, there's a lot here. There's a lot of very great richness. Art is very prevalent. There's lots of art in this place. So, it's grim. It's a bit brutal at times, but it is not barren of art and expression. So this is not a Stone Age game where you're like, oh, we're playing in the Paleolithic era and there's nothing going on. No, you've got the city-states are massive. Each of them could be close to 1,000 years old. They're ancient cities that have been expanded upon for generation after generation. They are covered in carvings. They are covered in art and mosaics. They are covered in culture. And that's something important. So the first pillar is resource scarcity, and that is something that you need to bear in mind when you are playing in a Dark Sun game or when you're setting a Dark Sun game up. Keep that resource scarcity in mind, because resource management, like metal, is going to be something that your party is going to kind of focus on. Same goes for food and water. Those are two things that are a little more on the scarce side. And that is exemplified by the fact that the city-states in the Dark Sun setting, if there's a food shortage, they will go to war with each other. The entire city-state's army will go to war just to steal food from the fields of another city-state and bring it back. Now you can imagine what kind of situation this would create. We're looking at feuds between sorcerer rulers. Call them kings, you can call them queens, you can call them whatever you like. Fact is that they are wielders of magic, and they are the absolute rulers of each of their domains, which typically consist of one city-state and one or two outlying villages or towns that support that city-state's industry. So one of the other pillars that supports Dark Sun, that kind of gives the setting its flavor, is how it treats magic. Magic is a very destructive force in the Dark Sun setting. You've got two different kinds of magic users. There's defilers and preservers. Now, defilers and preservers are both hunted by the average person, and especially by the sorcerer kings and their allies, because defilers gain their magical power by draining the life force from the land around them. They drain the life force from the land, not from the people, not from animals, So you're not looking at like blood magic, draining the blood from something in order to fuel your spells. This isn't that kind of thing. This is literally a case of if a defiler casts a spell, then anywhere from 3 to 10 meters around them, all plant life dies and cannot be brought back. The soil itself is rendered impotent and sterile for maybe months, maybe years, maybe decades after one spell has been cast. That one spell could be a level 1 magic missile. So magic is sharply controlled in order to maintain what little plant life and agriculture remains to each of these city-states, and protect it from people that would try to usurp it or would try to use it to fuel their own power-hungry grab for more. There's no gods in the Dark Sun setting. They don't exist. Instead, a cleric worships one of the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And as you can imagine, water clerics tend to be in high demand. But the others are also highly respected because they commune with the elements of life. Now, the other people who have a clerical style of magic are the Templars. And the Templars are servants of each of the sorcerer kings, or the rulers of the city-states. So they get their magic directly from the ruler of the city-state. Now, in more modern D&D terms, I would kind of consider them to be more akin to a warlock with a patron, and the sorcerer king is the patron of the Templars that work for them. They function as kind of a bureaucracy. They handle everything from distributing of the food to, in some cases, they negotiate with trading companies that come in to trade with the city. They also are in charge of hunting down rogue defilers and preservers and bringing them to a swift and deadly justice. Templars are not liked. They are not good people for the most part. Some of them might be. They might be, looking to serve the better the lives of the people that they work for, or the people of the city. But ultimately, they work for the Sorcerer King, and the Sorcerer King, they're not kind people. They're not. So, and preservers have less power than defilers, but their magic is very much centered on preserving what magical power or what life energy remains to the world of Athos. Their spells do not defile the land. They do not take from the land to cast the magic, because they very much believe in putting something back into the land after they have cast their spell. So it's kind of like the preserver's sort of that person that you cut down a tree, you plant at least one tree in its place. That's what the preserver kind of is. They still take from the land, but they try to give back. Sorcerer Kings still don't like them because preservers could eventually become a threat to the power base of a Sorcerer King and depose them. And it's been hinted that this has happened in the past because there are city-states that no longer exist as a political entity and are simply ruins that poke out of the desert sands of Athos. So that's kind of magic in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it, but that's really the core concept of it. So we talked about resource scarcity and resource management. We've talked about magic. There's one other thing about it. I'm sorry, I didn't mention this is part of magic. It's psionics. Dark Sun is a world where almost everyone, in fact everyone really, has a psionic ability that they have somehow honed. And And some people have more psionic abilities than others. Some people have less. But everyone has some, excuse me, and everyone uses those things to better their lives. Now, this is actually not an element of Dark Sun that I particularly am fond of. It's something that I'm struggling to like, mostly because I remember rules for psionics being something that was clunky and awkward, and I didn't really understand it. I at least was able to understand how Vancian magic was supposed to work in 2nd edition. I had no clue how the psionics were supposed to work. It made no sense to me. So that's part of why Dark Sun probably didn't appeal to me, because I was still, focused on the idea of if psionics exist, then you have to use them. I'm not as attached to that opinion as I used to be, and I would suggest that you don't have to be either, because since psionics is like everyone has it, but if you take it away from everyone, not a whole lot changes, really, because it felt like it was just, it feels like when I look back on it, it feels like it's something that was added in to make sure that it's different, to make sure that the setting functions differently. And so here's this psionic special ability that everyone can get. And that's kind of cool, but I don't think it's needed. I think that the setting it stands on its own feet without psionics. So use it if you like, ignore it if you don't want to. It's there. All right, let's look at the different cultures. Let's talk about that for a moment. There's a lot of different cultures that exist on the planet of Athos and in Dark Sun. And you cannot talk about the cultures and the societies of the Dark Sun without mentioning a few particular things. The first one, there are no good, quote-unquote, societies here. There are no societies that are devoted to good gods and doing the right thing and the lawful thing and making the world a better place for everyone. That doesn't exist. Even the Veiled Society, which is all about their preservers and they're using their magic to preserve the life of Athos, they're very much a place where if you go against them at all, you will be killed. And that's kind of a common theme among Athos. They talk, there's a lot in here written about how the elves are xenophobic. I think that everyone in this setting is pretty xenophobic. It's very much a setting of each group desperately trying to hold on to what they have and willing to go to any means to protect it and to take something valuable from someone else. So raiding is a common thing, and patterns of power and control are very much written into the DNA of this setting. Slavery does exist in this setting. I know that's a distasteful topic for a lot of people. I'm not going to get too deeply into that right now, but I will say that it does exist. And in some of these cultures, kind of like, we can compare it to ancient Sparta. We've learned from our ancient Greek history. These cultures survive because they have this massive amount of slave labor. So if that's something that you find distasteful, you don't want to have in your game, you can take it out and simply have it where basically every citizen, or instead of having them being slaves, they could be indentured servants, if that makes you feel better, or you could simply say that they're the poor. It ends up being not the same thing, because that's not true, but it has the same story effect, which is fine if you don't want to deal with the baggage that comes with talking about the slavery. But I want to make that clear, is that that is a part of the setting. and that everyone in this setting, all cultures are equally awful. There are no good cultures. There's no one you can hold up and say this is a shining example of what a culture could be. Okay, so now that we've stated that, let's talk about some of the different cultures in there. The book takes great pains to paint elves as desert nomadic peoples who travel from oasis to oasis, tend to be herdsmen, and bring their flocks to the cities to sell them or to get into mercantile business. There's a lot of pain taken to explain that anyone who deals with an elf believes that elves are really not to be trusted, and you only do that if you are desperate. Maybe you're a defiler who needs to get magic item components. You would deal with the elves because they're the only ones who would be willing to deal with you as a defiler. So it's different because most campaign settings paint elves as sort of the ethereal other fairy types who are, either they live in their mounds and they come out to entreat with humans at like the fair folk of Celtic myth and legend, or they're like the Tolkien elves that live in their trees or in their hidden valleys, and they're mighty warriors and even greater magicians, but always they are on the side of good and light, or at least of the side of light. And here they're very much painted as a very negative society, very distrustful, where they're even distrustful of each other, where a tribe will not welcome members of another elven tribe into their midst, except under very limited circumstances. So that's kind of where the xenophobic elves comes from, but here the interesting part about this is they do mention that elves exist in the cities and not just as extensions of these tribes. So not all elves are these nomadic tribes. Some of them live a more urbane life, and so that's important to note. You don't have to be that kind of character if you want to play an elf. Halflings are described as, again, more of a nomadic tribe people who live in the areas surrounding the Tablelands. And the Tablelands is the main region that is described in the first box set of Dark Sun. So most of these images that you see depicting these swaths of sand and rocky inclines and big city states and all that stuff takes place in the Tablelands for the most part. Surrounding that, on the other side of mountain ranges, or there are actually lands of jungle where there's very, very deadly jungles filled with all sorts of monsters that will kill you as soon as look at you, because they want to eat you and they want to eat your face. And these halflings live in that environment. They live in an environment that is very much survival of the fittest at any given moment. And because of that, they've developed a culture that kind of focuses on that survival instinct. They do tend to get along with each other better than the other peoples in the Dark Sun campaign setting will get along with each other. Halflings generally don't go to war with each other. But that's mostly because they have bigger problems than their disagreements with each other. Their bigger problems are the bigger predators that are everywhere. They want to eat them. The one thing that is noted, it's kind of included as almost an aside in the description of halflings, but so many people focus on it. Halflings tend to eat living things. For example, they'll eat humans. They'll eat dwarves. They'll eat elves. They'll eat anything they can get their hands on. And a lot of people make a big deal out of this. And I think that that's something you should make a big deal out of, because it's definitely something that we would focus on because it's so strange to us. And if that's not something that you want in your Dark Sun, if you don't want that in your version of Dark Sun for your campaign, well, take it out. Get rid of it. It's an interesting flavor for those who like it, but if you think that draws too many connotations to certain cultures in our own world, or certain perceptions of cultures in our own world that are, very much socially unacceptable to talk about, then take it out, because it does not need to be in there for it to be Dark Sun, in my opinion. Just, think of some of the reason why the halflings are awful. Because remember, everyone is awful here. So no matter what you do, make sure that you keep that as part of the setting, that everyone is awful. And there are strict rules and structures to govern each of these groups to prevent them from being completely awful, to try to help there be a society. Because there actually is great and rich societies in this world, and it's really fascinating. But you just got to remember that no one's on your side. All right. There's more. There's half giants. They're kind of a race that are a people that was created by magic specifically to be beasts of burden or soldiers. There's the I think they're called the mules or mules. Anyway, they're a human dwarf hybrid that also was magically created by some sorcerer kings to fight in the arenas. Those things are awesome. They're cool if you like that sort of thing. I think that I would personally make some modifications to some of that if I was to run it, just because I don't know. I like the half giants. I'm not sure I like the mules. Excuse me. There's just weird connotations, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. But like I said, I'm not deep into the lore. This is just me coming at it. What else is there? There's the Trykean. The Trykean are a race or a people of mantis-like peoples that you can play as. They're a playable character, and they're kind of neat. They're unique to the Dark Sun setting. I don't think there's any other setting that really has anything like this, at least not back then anyway. Now we've seen more of that in other places, but I'm pretty sure that was the first time I had ever seen an insectoid playable, ancestry or heritage, if you will. And why that's interesting in and of itself is simply for the novelty factor. I think that if you really want to be pure Dark Sun, then you need to have the Trykean in there. If you're more interested in taking the concepts of the setting and telling human stories in that setting, the Trykean they serve as the alien other that you do not understand. And that makes them interesting, but I don't think that they necessarily serve any sort of narrative purpose aside from being like, hey, here's something that's different and cool, and it's got like up to 4 arms, and so you can manipulate that and play something different, and that's fine. And if that's what you want to do, then do it. There's one other thing about halflings I forgot to mention. Halfling culture and language are intrinsically melded together. But what I mean when I say that is you cannot communicate with a halfling without understanding their culture, because they will not understand you, because how they communicate is tied in intrinsically with their culture. It's not just language, it's not just words, it's cultural actions, it's axioms, it's things. And so I would liken it to that episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Darmok, where Captain Picard finds himself beamed by an alien by an alien ship. He ends up beamed down onto this planet with the alien ship's captain, and he has to learn to communicate with this man while being stalked by some unseen horror. And what he ends up learning through this exercise is that this species communicates through phrases from their own epic poetry. So instead of saying, wow, I understand, you say, oh, I can't remember all the names, but like something, his eyes open. And that's kind of how I view how the halflings in this would be communicating. They would not be communicating with standard phrases or, like, do you want to buy the things? Or any sort of accent that you can imagine. They would be communicating through cultural axioms. And they would not mean exactly what is being said. And that's something that if you wanted to portray the halflings as they're written, you'd have to be working very hard on. Because that would be probably the hardest thing to portray as a DM or as a player who wants to play a halfling who's trying to make themselves understood by this culture that they're going into, because they also don't understand. Because how can they understand this concept of language without cultural context? They're constantly going to be looking for the cultural context of everything. And you say, hey, do you want some peas with that? And they're going to wonder, what's the story behind the peas? Who's this you? What do you mean? How can this exist? Like, how does this exist with the Dharmak kind of concept? And that's really kind of cool. So anyway, I have rambled on a lot. So that's the cultural diversity within Dark Sun is pretty wild. It's pretty varied. It's pretty grim in places. But that's another one of the pillars that kind of underpins Dark Sun. So you've got resource management and resource scarcity. You've got magic that is deadly and dangerous and will get you probably killed if you're caught casting spells. You've got these different cultures that kind of throw all the tropes that we've come to expect on their heads, so that no one people is going to be what you expect. And everyone's equally awful. So those are the kind of the three things that underpin the Dark Sun. But within that, there's this richness that can exist, because you can have a story where your characters, they start off in the city-state of Tyr, and then they have to travel to a whole nother city-state, and the journey becomes the adventure, because in the Tablelands there are wild things. There's flora and fauna, and the flora will also try to kill you. And the fauna will definitely try to kill you. And I think it emphasizes the kind of adventures that you can have. So a lot of RPGs, and this will be the last point that I make, but a lot of RPGs focus on the person versus person conflict of storytelling. And that is, I am an adventurer, and my goal is to complete my mission, and that person or that group stands in my way, and I'm going to have conflict with them. Very rarely do we have experiences in most RPGs where the land itself is the enemy. The land itself is trying to kill your character. And most of that is because players don't tend to find it fun, and so a lot of DMs aren't going to be too detailed about all the different things that happen in the wilderness, because people think it's boring. I highly disagree personally, but that's fine. I'm not here to educate everyone and tell you you're playing it wrong, because you're not playing it wrong. You're having fun, and that's the important part. And that's something that Dark Sun doubles down on, though. Dark Sun doubles down on person versus environment storytelling. Because of that resource management, because once you leave that city state behind, you only live as long as you have water and food. And you only have the water and food that you can carry upon yourself, unless you happen to be a cleric who worships water, or this elemental spirit of water, and then you'll have some water for a while, but that's not a whole lot. You're still in danger. The land itself will kill you if you don't take precautions. If you travel during the heat of the day, temperatures can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit in places, and that's way too hot for most living things to survive. You will find yourself you cannot, if you are on foot walking, you cannot drink enough water to stay alive. That they make that point very clear in this. So most people, most humans, will travel in caravans, or they will travel in with beasts of burden carrying lots of water. They will travel at night if possible. There's a lot of things that go into planning travel. Travel from one place to another is not a small thing, because you are fighting the environment. You are fighting the wild creatures of Athos. You are fighting, it's not wolves in the woods. These are monstrous creatures. And I think that's an important aspect of the Dark Sun campaign setting, is acknowledging that everyone is awful. No one trusts each other. Everyone only works with each other so long as they are forced to by customs, and by knowing that if they don't work with each other, then someone might come in and kill them. But as bad as all that is, the wilderness environments are worse. But within those wilderness environments, there are ruins that contain secrets of the world before, because ultimately the setting of Dark Sun is a post-apocalyptic setting. There was a land before, probably before the defilers came, and this land was a beautiful, vibrant world full of water and plants, castles, great cities, empires, what have you. And there was a lot of magic in this world. And in the thousands of years, or at least over 1,000 years at least, of what this world has been like since the coming of the defilers, and since Dark Sun as a world has started to deteriorate, those cultures have vanished beneath the sands. They have been destroyed. They have become nothing. But their ruins remain, and within those ruins, you might find an iron sword yet that it still hasn't been discovered. You might find a hidden cache of magic items, or spearheads, or the ultimate treasure, a pitcher of ever-flowing water. All these things still might exist out there in these ruins, and so that's the great kind of adventure in the Dark Sun, is going into those places, battling the environment to get there, because that's no easy task. Especially because if these places were easy to get to, then they would have already been looted by now in the last 1,000 years. So first you get to it, battling the environments. Then you have to battle the environment of whatever this place is. Maybe you need to dig out silt from chambers within it as the silt sea is threatening to overcome the area. Maybe you have to, maybe you had to travel with not just enough water to get you there, but enough water to sustain you and then to get you back. And now you've got to defend that water from other desert creatures that want water and are desperate to get it because they need it to survive. And suddenly you're there and you've got it and they want it. So again, that could be person versus environment. And that whole thing is powerful and poignant and much more real in Dark Sun than it is in some other settings. So anyway, that's all I want to talk about for right now. There's a lot more in here that's really fun. There's a lot more details. I could, gush about, the merchant houses and how they work and stuff like that. I might do that in a future video. But anyway, I've been enjoying it, and it's made me think about, running a game in this setting, or even just taking concepts from this setting and incorporating them into my own games or my own settings that I'm working on, because there's just some neat stuff here. And if you don't mind wading through the awful to get there, then there's some rich story. If the awful offends you, don't bother. It's okay. I'm not saying that people need it, because there's other great settings out there. If you want a campaign setting that has a lot of elements like this without some of the negative connotations that exist in this setting, then grab Numenera, because there's a lot in Numenera that reminds me of Dark Sun, and especially there's certain areas within the Numenera setting that are very much a Dark Sun-esque place, without a lot of the negative connotations and things like the slavery and the outright, kind of racist attitudes that are kind of baked into this thing. And you don't have to worry about, trying to take that stuff away or figuring out how to present it in a respectful manner or having your players fight against it. And whatever, if you want the desert exploration without all that stuff, you can play Numenera. If you want to take pieces of that stuff, you can play Dark Sun with only pieces of it. That's cool too. Anyway, I've talked long enough. Thank you for listening. If you've stayed with me this long, I appreciate it. Hope you enjoy yourselves. Peace be with you. Bye-bye.